So, since today is Father's Day, I decided to start with a little story to offer some encouragement to the fathers in the room and those who may be listening at home. This story is about a father who has two children, a boy and a girl, and he passionately, deeply loved his kids. He did everything he could for them. He gave them a nice place to stay, took care of all their needs, taught them how to act and behave and what's right and wrong. But these kids, they rebelled against their father. They broke the biggest, most important rule, which has scarred them for life. But then his father, he went on, he had more kids. And every single one of his kids rebelled against him. Now, an outside observer could be looking at the situation, could watch this father had all these kids that constantly rebel against him. And somebody may look at that situation and say, that is not a very good father. Eventually, when all these kids, go into lives of sin, eventually do you start blaming the father? People maybe start thinking those things. But you know what? The father in this story that I'm telling you is God himself. Because, he started with Adam and Eve, gave them everything they needed, but they rebelled against him and sinned. And all of us, we are all God's children. We all choose sin, which is an act of rebellion against him. So any fathers here, if people ever tell you you're not doing a good job, you have made mistakes, you know what? You don't need to listen to them because, they would say the same thing about God too. Instead, we listen to God. We listen to God's voice, who says we are doing a good job because he knows how much effort you are putting into it. Well, today we are continuing my series, A Summer of Music. And today's song we're going to talk about is The Voice of Truth, which talks about, what voices are you going to listen to? Because there are many voices in this world. So we're just going to start off by just listening to the song. It's a song most of you probably may know, or at least will recognize once we play. It's been around for a while, and it was at least very popular for me. So let's go ahead and play Voice of Truth by Casting Crowns. So when I was preparing for the sermon, planning the sermon, I wanted to pick a song that actually affected my life, one of the songs that's especially important to me. And this is one of those songs that I turned to when I was going through hard times, tough times in life. And Mark Hall, the guy who wrote it, the lead singer of Casting Crowns, the guy you saw singing there, he wrote the song. And it came out of tough times he had, especially growing up. Because Mark Hall learned from an early age, he had learning disabilities. He realized he didn't learn as well or as fast as the other kids around him. And he was diagnosed with things like dyslexia and ADD, and so he knew he wasn't as good as the other kids. So Mark Hall, about fourth grade, he told himself that, I am not enough, and I need to be okay with that. Could you imagine a fourth grader telling themselves, decide at that young age that they were not enough, and they just have to be okay with that? That's that voice he had going through his head growing up. When he was in those special ed classrooms, and he was just not as good as any other kids around because he couldn't read as well or learn as well as them. Constantly told himself that he was just not enough. And you can see these struggles and pains he went through in this song. Let's look at some of these lyrics. Because one of them is, but the waves are calling out my name, and they laugh at me. Reminded me of all the times I've tried before and failed. You just imagine little Mark Hall going to school, struggling in reading and math, the history, whatever. And all these other kids, or even teachers, reminding him that he can't do it. He's not that good. He's not that smart. These people telling them, you failed, you can't do it. Now, do you have people in your life who remind you of your failures, who bring up your past, who say, you failed this, you can't do that? Do you have people in your life who do that to you? I wouldn't be surprised if the person in your life who brings up your past the most, who reminds yourself of your failures the most, is actually you yourself. Because we are often our harshest critics who tear ourselves down. Because we listen to these voices that say, you can't do it. You've tried, you failed, you can't do it. We listen to those voices way too much. Another telling line in the song. Later on, he goes, "The giants keep on telling me, time and time again, boy, you'll never win. You'll never win." I just imagine Mark Hall growing up. He's trying to do well. He's trying to learn. But he has these challenges, you know. He doesn't feel like he's enough. He's not as good as the other students. He's not smart as the other students. And he keeps on hearing, he will never win. He can never do this. He will never learn it. He will never be as good as them. He will never succeed. These voices keep telling him those things. You know, he has these giants. You know, his primary one he talked about was his learning difficulty. You know, we may also have giants in our lives that tell us, you can't win. You will not succeed. That voice can be a voice of, relationships. It's not going to work out. You're never going to succeed at relationships. Or maybe that voice is the voice of work. You're not going to succeed. You're not going to make it. You're not as good as everybody else. You are going to fail at your job. Or maybe that voice is the voice of finances, saying you're never going to make enough money. You'll always be in debt. You're always going to be behind. Or, hey, it's Father's Day. Maybe that giant, maybe that voice is saying you're not a good enough father. You're not a good enough parent. You're going to fail at parenting. Or maybe your giant that keeps telling you you can never win is that sin that you've been fighting for years and years, that you're trying to get rid of, you're trying to avoid, you're trying to get out of your life, but it's hard and you can't seem to do it. It tells you you will never win. We have all of these voices telling us these things. And I'm going to say something now that you're probably not expecting to hear. It's not something a preacher would say on a Sunday morning trying to encourage his people. But it's true, so I have to say it. And it's the first line in your bulletin if you're doing the outline, up here on the screen. Ignoring the voices of this world is hard because they have some truth to them. Because if they remind you of your failures, of your past, that is your past. You have failed. That is true. They tell you you're not as good as somebody else. That may be true. We all have different skills. These voices that try to keep us down and tell us things, they are not necessarily telling lies. We have failed. Maybe we're not as good as we want to be or as good as somebody else. They have truth to them, which is why they are so hard to ignore. That's the bad news. But the good news is they don't tell the whole story. They don't know the whole story, so they can't tell the whole story. The voice of truth, which is God's voice, he tells the whole story because he is the only one who knows the whole story because he knows who you really are. He sees your mistakes. He sees your flaws. He knows your past. But he also sees your heart. And he sees your successes and sees how you tried. So let's take a look at some of the things God says. Let's look at his voice from the Bible. Let's look at Psalms 139, verse 14, and see what he tells us about ourselves in this psalm. Psalms 139, verse 14, it says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." So when the voices of this world, they tell you you're not good enough, you are less than, that is not what God says. God says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And we know that God's works are wonderful, and we are one of those works. We are wonderful. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. That is God's voice. That is what he is telling us. Yes, we have flaws. Yes, we have mistakes. That doesn't matter. We are children of God, his creation. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. That is the truth. That's the voice we need to listen to. Let's look at another verse. Another thing God tells us. Another voice we need to be listening to. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 6. This one says, "So we say with confidence, 'The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?'" So when people bring up your past, when you remind yourself of your failures, listen to God's voice. He is your helper. He is there to help you. You can use His strength, not your own. Yes, you have failed. Yes, things have happened, but you have God on your side to help you. That is the voice we need to listen to. That is God's voice. You know what? It took Mark Hall a long time to realize he was listening to the wrong voices. It wasn't until he was about 20 years old when he started reading the Bible for himself. Because, he had reading issues. It took him a while to get there. But when he was about 20, he was reading the Bible. And he was reading the stories of all these great heroes of the Bible. And he realized they had flaws. They had problems. They made mistakes. They were not perfect. He was especially drawn to the Apostle Paul. The great apostle who wrote most of the books of the New Testament. Mark Hall was blown away that Paul repeatedly, often, in almost every book, bragged about his weaknesses. Now remember, Mark Hall, he was ashamed about his weaknesses. He thought his weaknesses made he was less than everybody else. He was not good enough. But Paul, he bragged about his weaknesses. That just blew his mind. That's why this was the verse he based the song off of. So let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10. This is the verse Mark Hall used for this song. And this is a verse that really meant a lot to him. But before we read it, let's get a little background for this verse. Because right before this verse, you see Paul tell the story where he pleaded with God. Because he had what he called a thorn in his flesh. He had a problem with himself. He had a weakness. He had a flaw. He had something that just wasn't right. Something that didn't make him feel good enough. And he pleaded with God to take it away. But God told him no. So let's read what God said, why God said he told him no. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. It starts with, "But he said to me," but God said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore," this is Paul speaking now, "therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong." Paul celebrated his weaknesses because he knew when he was weak, he could rely on God's strength to be strong. So here's how I will sum up what Paul's saying. In our weaknesses, in our failures, it's then that we trust in God and His strength. Because if we didn't have weaknesses, if we had to make mistakes, if we didn't have parts in our lives where we felt less than, we would never have a reason to rely on God and His strength. And when God comes out with His strength, that's when amazing things happen. Which is quite often, as the song goes, it encourages us to step out of our comfort zone. God's voice regularly asks us to come out of our comfort zone and do things we're not comfortable in. To go do things in the areas of our weaknesses and not our strengths. Because in our weaknesses, that's where we get God's strength. It's when we rely on God and His help. And as the song goes, then we can do it for His glory. Because if we did stuff on our own with our own strength, we would have no reason to glorify God. But because we have weaknesses, we have faults, we have these problems in our lives where we can rely on God, we can still do great things we couldn't imagine we could do, and God be glorified through it. Mark Hall, he gave examples in his song of this. First, he did one of Peter. So let's read a little bit of that. It's how actually the song starts. It says, "Oh, what I would do to have the kind of faith it takes to climb out of this boat I'm in onto the crashing waves, to step out of my comfort zone into the realm of the unknown, where Jesus is." And he's holding out his hand. Isn't that a great image? God calls us to the areas of our weaknesses, where we feel less than, we don't feel like we're enough. Because the story's about Peter, when Peter walked on water with Jesus. There's a storm going on. Jesus was walking by, and Peter asked, "Can I come out with you?" Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on the water with God. And the image in the song says, and God was waiting there. Jesus was waiting there, holding out his hand to help him in this area of his weakness. Everybody's weakness is walking on water. But God was there to help him in that weakness to walk on water. But I find it fascinating the use of Peter here and his example of faith. Because in Peter's life, he had times of great faith, like when he walked on water. He also had times with little faith, like when he denied knowing Jesus. And then he had other times with great faith, like when he boldly proclaimed the gospel to people and performed miracles. We have these voices coming at us. And yes, they look at our failures to keep us down. But they can also look at our successes to make us proud and not want to rely on God. So I think this is a lesson Paul learned about what voices to listen to. Peter did not let his successes or failures control him. He learned only to listen to God. Because yes, when we listen to our failures, it makes us feel like we can't do nothing. So then we don't want to do nothing. But when we listen to our successes, it makes it feel like we can do everything by ourselves. We no longer rely on God and his strength, and no longer glorify God, which pulls us away from God. We don't listen to our successes, or our failures. We just listen to God. We listen to that voice. The other example he gave was with David when he faced Goliath. Let's look what he said there in the song. It says, "The giant keeps on nope, wrong part. Oh, what I do to have the kind of strength it takes to stand before a giant with just a sling and a stone, surrounded by the sound of 1,000 warriors, shaking in the armor, wishing they would have the strength to stand." That is a lot of faith, where you are required to listen to God's voice and not anybody else's voice. Because David had 8 older brothers. And so his dad regularly overlooked him because he was the smallest and he was the weakest. And then when war came, David wanted to come help. He wanted to fight the giant. The king said, "There's no way you can do this. You're too small. You're too weak. You're not strong enough. You're not skilled. You can't do that." David had all of these voices telling him he couldn't do it. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't smart enough. He wasn't strong enough. He couldn't do it. Every other voice was telling him he couldn't do it, but one. God's voice, the voice of truth, was telling him he can do it. So the lesson David learned by listening to God's voice. He learned that David, he had faults, or if you wish, you can put their limitations or weaknesses, or however you would wish to describe yourself. But David had his faults. But he listened to God and his voice, and therefore he was victorious. Because, we don't need our strength to be victorious. If God is calling us to do it, he will give us the strength to get it done, no matter what it is. Because God says, "Do these things, do them for my glory." We listen to God's voice. It calls us out of our comfort zone. into the realm of the unknown where Jesus is. And he's holding out his hand. He is waiting for us to take that leap of faith, to listen to his voice and only his voice. Ignore your own weaknesses. Ignore your own limitations. Because things God tells you to do sometimes does not make sense. It wouldn't make sense for Peter to step out of a boat and try to walk on water. It wouldn't make sense for little David to go fight a giant Goliath. The thing God tells you doesn't make sense. But we listen to his voice. We rely on his strength. We can do great things. Because the voices of this world, they tell us all kinds of things. And as I said before, many of the things they say are true, which makes it hard to ignore because they tell us truths, but they tell us partial truths. They don't tell us the whole truth. It is only God who tells the whole truth. Because the world tells us we are weak. And you know what? That's true. And as Paul says, we should rejoice in our weaknesses. We should rejoice in those times when we are weak, that we have failures. Because that means we can rely on God, on his truth, and his voice, and his strength. So here is what I want you to get from today's sermon. This is what I want you to take home with you. It's short, it's simple, and I think it's a little fun. Today, I want you to learn to listen, obey, and don't be afraid. We listen to God's voice, and only God's voice. You have to learn to recognize his voice, which is a whole nother sermon. But we recognize God's voice. We listen to only God's voice. But listening is only the start. Then we have to obey. We got to step out of that boat, step out into that battlefield and face that giant. We got to listen. We got to obey. And then we don't need to be afraid because God is with us. He has given us his strength, and he's waiting there with his hand out, ready to help. If you will come out and take that leap of faith and be with him. If we listen, obey, and don't be afraid. That is what this voice of truth is telling us. Listen to God, obey God, trust God. Well, now we come to our time where we're going to sing our hymn of decision. And we're going to sing Voice of Truth because it's not your typical worship song. But I preached about it, and it's good enough. But as we sing this song today, I want you to sing it as a promise to God. Sing it to God. Tell him you will listen to him and only him. That you are willing to take those leaps of faith. You are willing to go wherever he calls you to go. Because he is the voice of truth. And you will rely on his strength. Use this song as a prayer to God. That you will listen to his voice. So let's stand. Let us sing Voice of Truth.